We are off. Okay, good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, good evening, wherever you're calling from. Great to have you on board with us this afternoon. If you just please bear in mind to keep your microphone on mute. You can use the chat box as our previous webinars. Ricardo and my co-host will be monitoring that. I'm delighted that we've got Derek O'Riordan and John Fletcher joining us this afternoon to talk all things decision making, and I'm just going to give them an opportunity to introduce themselves formally. So Derek, we'll start off with you, pal.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me on, Bobby. I'm obviously a coach, a rugby coach by trade, and a coach developer that works across a number of sports within the system in Scotland, primarily golf, football. I've done a wee bit with basketball and triathlon as well. And in the day job, I work with a number of sports to help them develop their coaching systems, which includes coach education, coach development. I also work with our institute around how we can support the development of performance coaches. So what does their learning look like? And yeah, that's me. Over to Fletcher, I suppose.
Thanks, and again, Bobby, thanks for the opportunity, mate. So John Fletcher, sport would be rugby, so spent a lot of time in rugby around both the academy and performance level, as in the first team stuff. Recently, over 10 years within the performance programme within England Rugby. Recently set up a company called the Magic Academy with Russell Earnshaw, aka Rusty, and the Magic Stig. Moved off the grass more and more and sort of on to supporting coaches. So a bit of mentoring, helping some individual, helping some teams, just around make some sense around coaching. That's me.
Awesome, thanks both. And originally we did have a football coach on with us, but today we've got two rugby coaches. But I think there's some great parallels between handball and rugby, but more specifically around what we're going to get into around the coaching stuff in terms of coaching behaviours and how we design sessions and such. But we really wanted to start off with, with the slides on, why we chosen decision making. Chaps, I might just open it up to you guys in a minute, but I come across three kind of quotes around decision making and adaptability in sport. One from Lionel Messi, one from John Wooden, the legendary basketball coach, and one, my favourite one, I suppose, out of these three is from Keith Davids, which Fletch actually had on a slide at our England Handball AGM last year. You can't adapt to an environment that you don't inhabit, which really got me thinking about how we are designing our sessions. Are we creating sessions that can encourage these decision-making opportunities, and are we really in tune with that stuff? So, chaps, anything on why do we think decision-making is like the a key aspect of what we should be putting our learners through?
Happy for Fletch to open up on that.
Yeah, I mean, your sport is a decision-making sport. Thousands, tens of thousands of decisions will be happening through, but as they're playing the games, clearly you want to replicate that within the training environment. So it's as and when they get to the game, it's things are sort of feeling a little bit more comfortable because they've experienced it in the past. I mean, that's fundamentally what it is that your practice, your training, and your practice design is there to be helpful and to help you have better performances, and then depending on what environment you're in, to go on and have success, whatever success means.
I suppose just to add to that, quite simply for me, adaptability is a competitive advantage, and our ability to make effective decisions relative to what we might see on court gives us the edge over a team who may be physically equal or physically dominant over us. Our ability to make effective decisions on court might be the point of difference around having competitive advantage or not.
Cool. So today we have, just trying to move the slides on again, we're going to try to experiment with some polls that we haven't done before. So right now we're going to ask you guys to think about how much time you dedicate to your decision-making practices in your sessions. So I'm going to start off with trying to launch this one. It might even give you the second one. But if you guys can take some time just to think about how much percentage you're dedicating in your sessions, I'll give you guys 30 seconds or so on this. we've got some examples from other sports in terms of what they might be doing as well. So that could be interesting for us to take a look at. Can you guys see the poll?
I think everyone can see it, but at least from my end, I can't seem to be able to choose any of the options.
Okay, I can see people engaging on it now.
Okay.
So that's cool.
I think you've got to answer all 3 questions before you can submit.
Okay, cool. Then that just gives us something for a bit later on. Going to give you guys another 20 seconds on this. We're getting a real nice healthy spread across the percentages, so that's cool. Okay, we're going to stop that in a couple of seconds. Okay, I might be able to restart the poll shortly if we need to look at the other questions. But so just on that one, chaps, we've got in the lead, it's probably 40% of the time is dedicated to session design, to decision making. So I'm just going to share my screen with you guys now. This is a study that was done this year across 4 countries in Europe on youth academy football and how much time coaches are spending on decision making practices. And we can see that Portugal's way up with almost 70%, Spain just below, and then just below 60% is England and Germany, which for me was a bit of a revelation. I work in academy football, and I've seen some really good stuff happening, but I had no idea that those kind of figures would be kind of mentioned. Fletch and Derek, have you got any comments on this at the moment? I mean, Fletch, I've spoken to you briefly about this stuff. What would you expect in those sort of performance environments?
Yeah, it would be up towards the 70 plus. Would be ideal. I would have thought anything below that, you probably need to have a look at your practice design, how you're designing the practice. What is non-active decision making? I think some people might be curious to what that language means, mate. Do you want to explain that?
Sure, yeah. So those were practices where there was not one decision was being made, so there was no choice in the practice. It was very much a repetitive movement pattern. We might call it blocks practice or isolated practice. So it might be developing their passing skills, their 1v1 skills, but there's no decision in the moment. So there's maybe ball manipulation, that type of stuff.
Yeah, and again, I'm similar to you. I've done some work in football. I can just share what I've noticed. I think that would be often at the start of the session. So actually how we start the sessions, what I've probably noticed, I think a higher amount of the non-active decision making would probably come at the start, where we feel as though that's a good way to start training sessions. So that's definitely something that I've noticed. I mean, I would be urging and pushing coaches to think about how they're actually going to start. What do you want the start of the session to look like? And clearly you would want that red column, the active decision making, you would want that much higher, up towards minimum 70%, but even that's pretty low.
Derek, just for the sake of some balance, sorry Fletch, were you finished?
Yeah, I was, mate, yeah.
Derek, for the sake of balance, Fletch is obviously saying about pushing the numbers up more towards 70%. What would you say would be the trade-offs if we're going up that way? What might we be losing?
It's not necessarily the trade-off. I mean, I remember in the early stages of my coaching career asking how do I build more effective decision makers, and somebody just gave a really neat nugget to me around you've got to put decision making on steroids within the context of your environment. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they've got to make decisions in game, but they've got to make decisions around what the makeups of the team look like, what does a warm-up look like, who's doing the water, who are the duty teams. And instead of you having to instruct, you're basically inviting a view from the group to inform how that decision is made. And I'd probably add, within that 60-70% in Spain and Portugal, what I would want to understand is, are they making decisions for decisions' sake? And actually what's being done around the quality of those decisions, because you might have sessions where there's active decision making taking place, but how often are those decisions being audited? Not necessarily to make sure they're the right one, but just to check and challenge the level of cognition that sits behind the decisions that athletes are making.
Eric,
Yeah.
Could you give me some examples how you would do that?
It's that whole reflection on action, in action, for action. So I've seen some stuff that you and Rusty do, where you might pause a session, just ask a question as to why they've done a certain thing, and if an athlete's able to provide or a player's able to provide some pretty sound rationale for making that decision, irrespective of the outcome, you respect the decision making process, right? Because that enables them or empowers them to make more decisions more often.
Yeah, and again, I think maybe in something similar, maybe in a slight build on that, actually pause and ask somebody else why they think that person's made the decision, because clearly shared decision making or shared affordances is the stuff that is really important. Often the player and the coach are having a good conversation, but the other people involved in that decision making process.
That's a really good point, Fletcher, around developing shared mental models. So a degree of coherence across the team around how we might make those decisions collectively and independently in response to a performance problem that we might see within the game.
Yeah, so for those coaches who are using freezing and pausing and trying to sort of check in with with the why, I do think we tend to go to the person who's been directly involved with the action. I think it would be also useful to check in with the people who are indirectly involved with the action, probably those closest, or maybe even from a defensive point of view. So if an attacker's done something, what actually have the defense noticed, so they aren't necessarily directly involved. But so just be mindful of why you would use something like a freeze or a pause or to sort of check in around the decision making process.
Yeah, I think just to build on that, Fletch, because that's a really nice point. One of the questions that we may ask or probably could ask is just around what specifying information was there for them to make that decision. So then they're not just drawing something out of a playbook. Actually, and that's a really neat point that you made around asking maybe the defense or the offensive side of the ball as to why they believe they made that decision. It's really around that ability for people to recognize what's in front of them. That's where you want the decisions to come from ultimately, is in response to an affordance, as you said, or a picture that's being laid out in front of them. So that's a really nice point.
And again, I don't mean to build on a build, and I'm definitely not going to use that language. But and I think Rusty does this really well. Rusty will also ask, and what else? Because there would be multiple opportunities, but not only to try and understand what the sort of current thinking was, but actually what else, right, go play type stuff. I think that's also a shout out. I'm not sure if he's on the call, but I think Rusty would do that really well. Would sort of stretch within that moment of, if you've used that freeze or that pause or something similar, to actually utilize that time well.
Yeah, and I think that's consistent. I think in some sports that I've worked in, specifically a sport like basketball, and I see it a lot in handball, where you've got a set motion or a set move that's building up to a shot. But quite often within that motion, a shot's opened up 3 or 4 times. But they're not looking for that specifying information because there is no decision to be made when they're operating within a scheme or a system. And I suppose just to lean on that a wee bit, Bobby, is to what extent do we afford freedom within the structure to go out of structure, to go out of system, when we recognise there is a decision to be made and a shot to be played?
That's a great question, Derek, and obviously I can't speak on behalf of the whole handball community. I might bring Ricardo in to speak about it from the GB men's perspective. Ricardo's our GB national team coach. Tell us about what happens in your training, Ricardo. How do you build the decision making into set plays?
Well, it's all about setting scenarios that allow them to make mistakes and to reflect on them whilst they're doing it. You try not to. It's like posing questions. You try to make them as open as possible. And when you set practice aimed at working some specific tactical model, what I'm looking for is to use a trigger that then will offer multiple options, and those options are chosen, taking into account all the factors that inform their decisions, as in position of the opposition and in relation towards the goal, moment of the game, and whatever. So what I'm trying to do is to keep, although I have a final goal, the path to that goal is for me as open as possible, trying to allow for them to make mistakes and to feel that vulnerability that will, make them think and reflect on what they've just done and what would be the better options for them. Hopefully that will improve their decision ability.
Yeah, and again, and I mean, some stuff for people to consider is within that more structured or that more stable environment, and there's advantages to having set plays and having some stuff that people have some clarity around. But even then, you want to create some things that are not certain, so some uncertain situations within that. So things like giving false information, actually deliberately not running it well. So what I've noticed about when people get into structured stuff, they don't, in my view, often they don't add enough instability and uncertainty within it. It always works. It kind of works like this. The defense or the attack, depending on which way you want to do it, is it's probably not posing the questions that they're going to have in the game. So structure and framework is clearly going to be useful and it's going to be helpful. However, even within that, there's going to be multiple options and multiple opportunities and decisions within that. And how we're designing our practice, what I've noticed is once we get into the structured stuff, we're still not designing through our practice enough instability so the players can actually make a so in the practice, I might be going top left, but actually the bottom right's open. And as a coach, you might want to deliberately create that situation.
It's quite interesting for me to hear a lot of the language being used at the moment is getting into this kind of the coach behaviours. So I'm going to move on to the how bit. Maybe we could be a bit more, explicit or break this. The how can we promote decision making a bit more, because I'm hearing things like allow players to do X, allow players to do Y, and it's really, for me, putting a big emphasis on the role of the coach in this. So first of all, perhaps we might have a look at what things might be holding back coaches from promoting the decision making through Derek and Fletch, your experiences of working with coaches over the years. What have been the biggest barriers for coaches to promote the decision making within their teams?
Just that they would probably want it to work more often, so they're in their brains are probably sort of thinking, look, I think a good environment would be a high success rate. You clearly would probably want less success at the start, and for them to search and find the information that's going to be helpful. So often the starts of sessions are not messy enough or chaotic enough, or there's not enough stuff that they've got to work it out. So I think how people would tend to start the other way. They would want to make it relatively successful, and then, that's the stuff that I've noticed. Probably a little bit also around. I mean, my preference would be to coach to outcomes a bit. So set some outcomes, and then actually allow more opportunity for the players to explore. Now that might be through some structure and some framework, but maybe set the outcomes and let the players just have more freedom to try and get the outcome. So if the outcome is, well, in this practice, we want to score X number of goals or certain types of goals, well, maybe just set the outcome. I think we're too rigid with the parameters that we set often. And I come back to my first point is often we don't start the session. We just want too much success too early. And I don't think that's helpful.
Okay. Derek, anything to add?
Yeah, I'll maybe point at a worked example of that. So the way in which I conduct my work at times is I would arrive with a camera, video a coach's session, and generate some data within a framework of observable behaviours that I will then look to generate some feedback for the coach. So some of those behaviours that we look for might be around how they question. So do their questions converge on a yes or no answer, or are they relatively divergent, so they're promoting reflection within the athlete? But also, to what extent are they responding to questions from the athlete? So to what extent is the athlete engaged in that learning activity, and therefore questioning and sense making with the coach? And if I give an example of a football environment that I've been working in recently, we had a coach that said, yeah, I'm really good at developing decision makers. I ask lots of questions. Now, when you code up the session and 80% of their questions are convergent, i.e. the response is either yes or no, then that tells me that, yes, you ask quite a lot of questions, but the questions aren't effective enough in developing decision making. Now, within the divergent questions that they asked, and there were some really, really powerful ones, I'm able to set a timer as to how much time and space the coach affords the athlete to reflect upon that question and then appropriate a response. And I was able to provide the coach evidence that on average it was 0.3 seconds he was waiting, and when he didn't receive a response, he was providing the answer. Now, developing decision makers isn't necessarily all about the way in which you design your practice, but it's the way in which you behave as a coach. And sometimes we've got to be really comfortable with uncertainty and silence, because silence is a space where people's ability to make decisions begins to emerge. Because people start developing cognitions or representations of how they might apply a performance solution to a performance problem. And sometimes they just need the space to figure that out so that they can make that decision more effectively next time around. Does that make sense? Is that consistent with you, Fletch?
Yeah, absolutely right. I think what I'm taking from that is that if you don't have that approach, you're constraining to how much you know. So
yeah,
so the players are going to be constrained by your knowledge and your experiences and your skill level. And yeah, quite frankly, if people are as good at rugby as what I was, then yeah, that's not that good. So yeah, absolutely right. I mean, that's a frightening stat, isn't it? That on average it's a 0.3 of a second wait before we actually interrupt or intervene or interject. It's clearly not only preventing possible better decision making, but also around the creativity.
Yeah, and I think we talked about this on Monday about the writing reflex, as in RIGHT, and our propensity or a desire within our knowledge base to almost impose our knowledge onto other people, and therefore the knowledge that they need to make decisions is constructed by somebody else, and what we need to be doing is supporting them to construct the knowledge for themselves, because then their appreciation and their depth of understanding around the performance solution that they've created to a performance problem is tenfold. It's magnified and it's retained. The level of retention and transfer from training into performance, if I'm providing the solutions, is minimal, which is why I really like this idea of messiness. So a messy practice that doesn't look very good in general translates into really robust performance. And I think you'd probably agree with me on that, Fletch, based on what you've seen in your experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, my preference is just to call it dynamic. I think it would sit better. It would probably tie into a little bit of stuff around the dynamic systems. But when people go messy and chaotic, I'm like, oh, right, thanks, great. I would say that as a compliment. However, in my head, I'm just thinking it's a dynamic. If there's some dynamism going on here, and yeah, I'm here to help the individuals in the group search for the information that's going to help them solve the problem. That's my role. Depending on the constraints, at times I might actually nudge them or decide to tell them some information, but often I wouldn't. I'd back myself of having some other skills around guiding them. And I think guide is a really useful word. Facilitating guide around coaching is around guiding them to the information that's going to help them solve the problem, which is fundamentally it's kind of
for sure
decision making is.
Guys, if I may ask a question, just to underpinning some of the ideas that were on the chat. There's obviously a pattern of connection between the perception of self-efficacy from the coaches and their willingness to show what they know. At the same time, the fear they have of that the athletes might think they don't know anything because they're asking too much. What would be your advice in this side of how we promote decision making to a coach that it's actually willing to do so, but has all those anchors, all those fears that could be dragging him and keeping him stuck in that notion of, say, using a bit more dictator behavior when he's in his sessions?
Yeah, I mean, from my point of view, it's around the coach sort of create an environment where people feel safer, and we can go on. That would probably be a different seminar, but definitely around them just being a bit vulnerable. So generally asking questions that they don't know the answer to, generally actually saying things, well, I actually don't know the answer to this, or is there a better way of doing it? Or so having that type of language and that type of intent, I think would be really useful, and for it to be genuine. So don't say you don't know stuff when you actually do know stuff. But the players will, all the time, they're getting a sense about what type of coach you are, really. So you're getting your feedback as a coach based on how they're going to behave. So if they're behaving like answering your questions, as in finishing off the sentence or telling you what you think they want to hear, that's actually feedback for the environment that you've helped create as a coach. So yeah, and yeah, some of it would come down to just having a really frank and open conversation about actually what we want this environment to be. But then make sure your behaviours then support what you say. You know, so I hear lots of people who say lots of cool stuff, but then unfortunately I see some stuff that's probably slightly different. So what you say and what you do need to be better connected. And ideally, and that's why, you know, people such as myself and Derek exist, get some support from some other coaches to give you feedback. Coaches, far too many coaches are like, they just really fear other coaches observing them and giving them feedback. And I think it's really weird, because the environment they're trying to create with their players is this an amazing environment where people are getting better and a challenge and high support. But far too often, I don't know what you find, Derek, and clearly there'd be some coaches who are all over getting better, but there is actually quite a lot of coaches. Often I find it more so in performance that are probably not, I'd probably challenge them on their ability to get better.
Yeah, and I think one of the problems that we have, certainly within the high performance space and performance space, is that coaching practice often goes unchallenged. So we have a view or a belief of what we think coaching effectiveness is based on our own internal representations of what we believe it to be. But quite often when we ask somebody to substantiate and justify why that is effective, they really struggle to articulate why. I do this is because this is the way it's always been done, or this is the way I've been coached, rather than there are many different approaches out there to sports coaching. And if we are really in the interest of working with our athletes and meeting them where they are, we may need to lean into one approach or the other, or a number of approaches relative to what their needs are. And that might be that we adopt an ecological approach at times, and it might be at times we need to instruct a bit more. And there's nothing wrong with a coach being not necessarily discursive, but using many different approaches to drive their athletes on, because no two athletes are the same, no two coaching sessions are the same, and no two contexts are the same. And so we need to have a number of tools, a number of approaches, a number of ways of attacking coaching in our armory to be able to work with the athletes that we're working with. And if I can just pick up on the word vulnerability, I think that you brought out, Fletch, that it's okay for coaches to feel like they don't know everything. Players are very attuned to picking up on coaches that are working on impression management and trying to put out all that they know, in the hope that they find out that the athletes don't find out all that they don't know, right? But in essence, it's perfectly fine, because if you look at this this approach to developing decision makers, and the coach working with the athletes to find performance solutions and co-creating and generating knowledge together, that is the richest form of coaching in my view, and it's the stickiest form of coaching in my view, because it's less do as I say. And it's more, we're all in this together. We're developing autonomy. We're leading into self-determination theory here around relatedness and autonomy, and the level of impact and power that has on the way in which athletes lean into you as a coach, but also perform on the court is crucially important, I think.
Some interesting stuff there, Derek, on the co-creation bit and the relatedness, self-determination theory aspect. And there's that quote: "If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together." That just jumped into my mind when you were talking about that stuff. Chaps, I just want to, maybe if we can, maybe it's a completely separate webinar altogether, but this idea around methodologies and different types of approaches to designing the session. We've already thrown out some words like ecological approach and isolated practice. there's clearly no right way to deliver a whole session, and it all depends on context, what you're trying to, what the outcomes are, and so on. But I'm wondering if there's people on this call that might not be so familiar with stuff like the ecological approach, because when we consider coach education in this country, I mean, I've been fortunate enough to go through recently level 3 in football, and there's been some interesting stuff around session design and methodology, but nowhere near to the level of stuff that is out there existing in podcasts and webinars at the moment. So I don't know whether Derek or Fletcher wants to kick us off with, but maybe a brief description of what the ecological approach might be, what constraints that approach might be, that kind of stuff.
Go on, Derek, you can start, I'll jump in.
Oh, great! Thanks for chucking me a hospital pass on that one. So really, the ecological approach is looking at a combination of ecological psychology and dynamical systems theory to represent the athlete as a self-organizing system, and we look at the constraints-led approach really is around how we might manipulate task, environment, or person constraints to create an adaptation within an athlete's performance, or to steer them towards a particular movement solution to a performance problem. So task constraints could be around the rules of the game. It could be around set conditions in practice. It could be around the size of equipment. Environmental constraints could be anything from environmental lighting. It could also be the cultural constraints within the sport. It could be the size and dimensions of the hall that you're working with. And then very much person constraints is what's happening for that individual. So you're looking at their psychological state, some stuff around their biology. So you're looking at where they are relative to peak height velocity, or how tall they are, how much they weigh, how flexible they are, how balanced they are, all things like that. Does that make sense, Bobby? Is that your...
Yeah, you nailed it from my understanding anyway, Derek. I mean, I think the interesting thing there is to see if people can pick up on what we're talking about in terms of those, just particularly around the constraint stuff. So the person constraints in handball, if we're pairing up tall players against short players and stuff like that, and you starting to maybe reflect on how you're setting up your practices to get the best out of your players. I'm sure coaches do that. I think it's giving them a framework as to how they might be able to get better at what they're doing. Fletch, anything to support or add to what Derek was saying?
Mike, well done. You definitely explained it better than what I would have. I think the vast majority of coaches will be pretty comfortable with using constraints. That some of them would probably benefit from understanding actually what is the purpose, and come back to the original point around this co-coaching. I think coaches would benefit from asking each other. So why did you do that? Why did you say that? What were you thinking about that? I actually would have possibly done this. I think they're really they're good conversations for coaches to have around constraints. Constraint is basically, as has already been said, you're doing something that is a boundary. It's going to restrict something, and then what a person or a group of people are going to do is they're going to come up with some solutions to that. So they're going to adapt. So if you change the size of a pitch, you move one side in a little bit. So that's a constraint. So what the individuals are going to do, what the team's going to do, is they're going to adapt. Ideally, what we need to do with constraints is not tell everybody what the constraint is. Again, what I've noticed within coaches is they're very keen for everybody to know everything all the time. And it probably comes back to the original point around them probably want people to get to the answers a bit quicker, might want it to look a little bit tidier. So I think we're comfortable using constraints. My challenge to the game is to really understand why, have those conversations as co-coaches, and possibly have them with the players at times as well, and include the players. What constraints would they add to make this an even better practice? So I think that stuff would be important. I know I focused a lot around the constraints. We actually got Danny Newcomb, who I think is awesome at practice design. He's the guy that makes the most sense to me, and he actually sent his top 6, which I can send to you, mate. It's look, if there was only 6 things, these would be the things I would look to focus on. So I can send that out around constraints. It's definitely something that I reference when I'm coaching, and obviously I'll be using constraints. It's something that I've got in the back of my head. This sort of, these are things for me to consider when I'm using constraints to try and shift or move behaviour or emphasize something or to reinforce something.
Yeah, I think that there's an important thing, I suppose, to mention on constraints and ecological dynamics, is that it's still relatively new in the consciousness of coaches and in the ether, and that can sometimes be really unhelpful when coaches are trying to make sense of that, because there seems to be a burgeoning tribe of people who are starting to adopt the ecological approach. And I don't pretend to know much about it at all. I mean, I've studied it at uni, but I don't have an in-depth enough knowledge to be able to apply it in practice. Now, I like to think through conditioned games or modified games, I am leaning towards an ecological approach or using constraints, but I wouldn't necessarily explicitly say I'm using a constraints-led approach. And I suppose the other important thing around that is that in using CLA or using conditioned games, they always have to be goal directed. So they always have to have a purpose and have a meaning. What is it that we're trying to achieve with that game, rather than just using that game for using a game's sake? And that's one of the things that I would really advocate around teaching games for understanding or using modified games or conditioned games. What decision is it that you're trying to promote? What performance problem are you trying to replicate? What performance solutions are you trying to find? And that, coupled with your coaching behaviors around, am I offering performance solutions? So my problem setting, am I creating problems, or am I problem solving? Am I teaching, instructing, and giving them my knowledge so that they can then, assuming that they can make that decision on court? Or am I helping them co-construct that knowledge so they're generating that knowledge for themselves, so I can have greater confidence in their ability to make that decision on court in the context of competition? Because you've got to remember, to a certain degree, in a lot of sports, less so in handball, the coach has got no control over the performance once the player goes over the whitewash or over the line. Now basketball and handball less so, but we've got to trust that what we do during the week is enabling players to be able to make those decisions for themselves in the heat of the moment on a Saturday or a Sunday.
Derek, that's really interesting, some of the stuff you've mentioned there, and especially leaning on to the competition side of things. We've had a question that's been thrown into the chat from Doc, and it's been something that I've been wrestling with myself the last, certainly since we've been on lockdown. And it's largely around the representativeness of our practices and how they might influence behaviour and ultimately performance in a match setting. So that transferability, and we alluded to it earlier on in the introduction. I recently read a study from some guys in tennis, and they were looking at tennis players in Australia in the youth performance levels, and looking at how their representative games that they had designed, that they used Hawkeye to monitor player position, how hard they hit the ball, strokes that they use, so on. And then they observed that against a 2-set match scenario. And they noticed that in the match scenarios, the players' behaviour was so much different to how it was in the games that they had designed, the practices that they had designed. And the authors had attributed towards like risk aversion. So as soon as it went into a match scenario, the players were far less willing to make a mistake, and they were playing a lot safer. So they're playing within themselves. So the question from Doc is around, how do we create those maybe psychological pressure moments in our training sessions that are going to transfer into better decision making on the pitch? I don't know if you guys have had particular experience in your rugby careers with implementing those kinds of things, because we see stuff all the time around consequences, physical punishments as a result of losing, and some maybe funny forfeits that we might have seen. And obviously, everyone's probably got their own stance on those things. But is there anything that you guys could particularly advocate or direct us towards?
I could probably give an example of a practice that I rely upon quite a lot around how do we transfer effective decision making into the game context. And we have a wee practice, which is, we call it red zone. we have 3 balls and we work 6 minutes non-stop, as an example. Now, the rugby pitch, when you look at it from left to right, is broken up into 5-metre lines, so a 5-metre channel on either side, a 50-metre channel on either side, and then you've got the space in between. And we would go pretty hard where the players had to work continuously in attack or defence for 6 minutes. And if there was a mistake, there was no chat. It was just rolling on the ball. They had to go to that and play again. So you're talking 6 minutes of continuous activity, high volume, high contact, high pressure. And by the end, they're getting really, really fatigued. And what you want to see is some effective decision-making happening around that point. Now, when the players ask, why are we doing that? It's not to flog you. So it's not a physiological effect that I'm looking for, although there is a physiological effect. Technically, tactically, you're going to break down. But what we want to get to is when your backs are against the wall, and you can't necessarily rely on system because we're not able to get into system quick enough, is what decisions are we going to make to close out a game and get the winning points that we need within the dying moments. Those are the kinds of practices that that I like to use around applying as much pressure as possible in practice, so that the game becomes easier. I don't know whether or not you've ever used something like that, Fletch, where there's very little in the way of conditions. It's just, here's a ball, we're going to go 2 minutes on the edge, 2 minutes inside the 15-metre channels, 2 minutes back out on the edge, and just to see how they respond. We audit some of those decisions on the back end, but we just leave them get on with it for 6 minutes non-stop. Would you use something like that, Fletch?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think and you mentioned at the start, it's around your practice design. I think some people, and I'm not accusing anybody who's written the question, I think some people think that they're doing it pretty well. So maybe they just need to have a look at it. I mean, sort of train hard, fight easy would be something that I'd be thinking about all the time. Definitely try and, I would always be pretty pleased if a player come off and go, well, actually that last 5 minutes or that moment in the game felt relatively comfortable because we've done it before or we've done something similar and we're able to draw upon it. So I think lots of people are talking about it, scenario this and, in game training and all that. But actually, once you actually get into it, probably again get some feedback, maybe use your analyst to actually give you guys some feedback about, well, what did that look like compared to the game? With the analyst, just be mindful of the stuff that you measure. So the players and you as a coach will probably shift your behaviour towards the stuff that you think is important. What's the stuff that you're attending to around the stuff that you measure? Another good strategy would be to, again, far too many environments always want to finish well. So we always want to finish on a good one. I would mix that up. I would more than often not finish on something not going well. You're more likely to have some conversations for them to sort it out. So there'd be some strategies around that. Actually, the reverse of that would be, what's the best 3 or 4 things happening in this training session? Let's actually replay them and really understand why they were so good. So the end of our training sessions, like the highlights, it's sort of the highlights reel. You might want to start your training session based upon something that didn't go well. So how would you actually fix it up? And you haven't had a meeting about it, you haven't spoke about it as a coach, it's just something that you're going to do pretty much straight away. That'll shift their mentality a little bit around sort of being a bit more game-like.
Yeah, I really like that idea of leaving them hungry, so finishing a session where they're really hungry to fix what's just gone wrong, but to some degree, and to use Chris Cushion's term, you're almost spitting in their soup at that point to say, well, actually, you don't get an opportunity to put that right. Off you go and think about why that was potentially wrong. The video analysis is a really neat point as well. It's just who has autonomy or control or responsibility for delivering the analysis, and quite often it's the coach or the analyst in front of the room presenting on what they believed to be some of the mistakes or some of the things that we need to shine a light on within the game. The further on I went as a coach, certainly within performance programs, is we pushed that responsibility back on the athlete, and there was a check-in with the coach in advance of the session around, was there anything that they believed that they missed, rather than us pontificating or professing what it is that we believe to where it all went wrong. Well, what we've got to appreciate is the athlete is the expert in the game, where the coach might be the expert on the game, and there are things that they can see and feel and notice in the context of the pitch or the court that we can never appreciate because we're not playing. And we need to lean in and respond to that and invite that feedback in order to one, go back to self-determination theory, make the athlete feel like they've got a say in how new knowledge or strategy is generated for them to inform how they might make decisions on court moving on. But also for the coach's perspective, it's just you might find some really novel solutions to performance problems that you might face again in the future, and working with your athletes to find those solutions, I think, is much more meaningful than standing up there and professing to be the fountain of all knowledge. Certainly my belief.
Right. I've got a question, just a bit more practical. There's some of our friends in Chile decided to obviously ask a couple of questions, and the question is very basic: is how would you or when would you start focusing more on decision making in terms of the overall preparation of players? And this is a question related to age stage more than anything else. So when would you focus more on this, and what process would you use to focus on decision making?
As early as possible. Now you won't be asking really sophisticated questions of a 6 and a 7-year-old, but you can start creating the conditions where asking questions is okay, and promoting reflection with your athletes is okay as early as possible. Because again, if you look at how chaotic perhaps rugby is early doors, largely the relationship an athlete has is between themselves and the object, and less so between themselves and the space that they've got around them. And what you want to do as early as possible through asking questions is sensitizing kids to specifying information within the environment that might lead them to do something different to what they are doing right now. And it's just around lifting an athlete's line of sight off a football or off a handball or off a rugby ball, and looking at the other individuals or the degree of space that they've got available to them beyond the scope of the object, if that makes sense. So certainly the cognitive development of a child largely is focused in on what they can see and what they can control early on. What we need to do is just widen their bandwidth a little bit as early as possible. If Fletch, would you agree with that? Or
yeah, mate, absolutely. Yeah, early on, as soon as you can. The younger they play, often the more creative they are. Anyway, clearly language. So the only thing you would adapt would be your language, really. So yeah, all of that stuff would be, I mean, basically what feeds decision making. So if you just think of this decision making thing as this, but what feeds it is awareness. So I think what you're talking about, Derek, and maybe jump in if it's not, is clearly what we're trying to do with everybody is just build their awareness, give them more information so they can make better decisions, because awareness is a posh word for information. So right from the start, you're trying to build their awareness. Often their focus when they're younger is around what's kind of in front of them and the stuff that's important to them. Often the ball or often the goal. So the things with the younger players is you just probably need them to stir. And that's why things such as freezes and actually maybe some constraints where they can and can't go are actually useful, because it just gives them a different perspective. You're building their awareness, i.e. you're giving them some more information, not giving them, but they're drawn upon more information to help their decision-making process.
Yeah. It's interesting, chaps.
I think there's
sorry, Derek.
I was just going to say there's one more point to that, in that decisions don't come from nowhere. They come from a knowledge base. Yeah. And there is a time and a place when we might need to teach and might need to instruct. And actually that we shouldn't shy away from the fact that we need to also perhaps provide some degree of a knowledge base or a resource base to which players can draw upon as they continue to construct new knowledge, but also how they're making decisions really early on. So although we say the X's and O's isn't everything, the X's and O's are still bloody important in developing the knowledge base in order to make effective decisions.
That's great. I was just about to ask that question, Derek, around the underpinning knowledge that the player might have to support their decisions. And I think, largely what you guys are talking about there is just finding that balance of how much we are maybe spending on passing techniques or in isolation compared to how we might put it across in, especially for young kids, into game-like scenarios. And the stuff that we were talking about before is the coaches being willing to actually release control and accept it might be a bit messy, it might be a bit chaotic, but the kids are actually going to be gaining lots and lots of skills out of that. So the awareness stuff is probably developing faster than their ability to throw the ball from A to B, for example, maybe at a quicker rate. I don't know.
Yeah, there's some additional stuff. So this is a definite and. So an and would be just highlight people who are doing it well. So, everybody go and touch the person who does this well or you think's doing it the best. And then actually get them to possibly explain. So Bobby, why are you doing this well? Or what's the stuff I've noticed that you're doing well? So I completely agree. Coaches should not shy away with a coaching tool is tell, inform, instruct. That is in our coaching tool bag, 100%. And if there's some constraints around whether it be time or there'd be some also, well, that's a really good tool. That is the best tool for this job. However, there would be some other tools in there as well. So again, I think the best coaches I've noticed, have a tool bag where they've got quite a lot of stuff in, but they just bring out the appropriate thing. They're trying to knock a nail in with a hammer. They're not using a screwdriver. But yeah, mate, there's lots of ways, but I don't think we should shy away from coaches where we may actually instruct and inform and or demonstrate. So sometimes you might just as somebody who at this moment in time is a better performer than them actually perform something so they can actually see it and copy it and try it.
Yeah, I loved what you said, Fletch, about running to or touching the person who's best at this skill. I wrote a blog recently around my experience as a parent watching my son explore an indoor skate park for the first time. And it kind of leans on social learning theory to an extent. So as a parent, I wasn't allowed on the or in the skate park. And so I watched my 5-year-old boy approach 8-year-olds, 10-year-olds, 12-year-olds to ask them how they perform certain tricks. And what's beginning to resonate is to what extent do we allow the space for players to ask other players how it is that they performed a certain task or why they made a certain decision. So why do we as the coach always have to be the one that speaks? And why don't we create the conditions through which some of our more adept athletes, players, are the ones who are teaching the less adept around what it is they need to do to perform the task or perform the skill or perform a tactic or perform a system or within a system a little bit better. And it leans into that social learning theory.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I'm definitely going to copy this because I'm going to clip that bit. We actually asked the players. So we had the players and we said, look, we just want you to share who you feel are the best coaches here. So they thought they meant the grown-ups. So when we actually sat down and explored what coaching was, actually we didn't get in the top 10. So me and Rusty didn't get in the top 10, which was a big shock to Rusty. But I mean, they would say, well, actually, Marcus Smith would be a real good coach around ball movement because I just observe him and have conversations with him. So you've got unbelievable coaches in your environment, and they happen to be your players. I love that. It's a question of, do we then have the skills to support the players bringing out? So I'll always remember a guy called Max Malins. He's about to break through as a standoff for Saracens, and I asked him to describe what he sees and what he's thinking around defence, and honestly, he went into some detail and some information that I hadn't even thought about. And this kid was 17 years of age. It was like, wow, that was just amazing.
Guys, just on that point, and I might be way off piste here, but it got me thinking around coach-athlete relationships and power dynamics and why the players might be more receptive to information from their teammates than from the coach. Have you guys got any insight into those I don't know, the way that players would take information from a coach compared to a player? Have you guys experienced that? I mean, you've clearly given examples of where it's been important, but
Yeah, I suppose it's just the nature in which power exists, or how power is perceived within that environment. So if I describe three different types of power to you at the moment, so you have legitimate power. So that might be say a new coach that comes into the environment. They've got legitimate power because the coaches don't, or the athletes don't necessarily know who he is, so they just assume that this person has power and they respond to that power, right? There's expert power, so somebody has a degree of power simply because they are an expert in, or they're really knowledgeable in a certain sphere or within a certain subject or discipline. But then there's one that around referent power, which is my interpretation is likability, right? It's respect, and generally the coaches who are the most successful ones are the ones that have that referent power. And the reason why athletes may lean into other athletes more often is simply because of the social structures that exist around them as peers. And it makes them more approachable when they're wanting to understand stuff. I think Anissa pointed to that a little bit around constructivism, and we talk about zone of proximal learning. And actually, who is it we're looking to make sense of, or to do any sort of learning whatsoever? I think by and large we look to people who know more than us to do that. Now, if there's a power dynamic between a coach and an athlete where the coach doesn't feel like they respect, or the athlete doesn't feel like they respect or buy into what the coach is about, then they look to their peers for that learning. So just picking up on that point, and that again, that's my own interpretation. Don't necessarily take that as true.
Interesting. Fletch, you must have come across this stuff in your time.
To be honest, I wouldn't have that much to add on that. To be honest, I think that was a real good summary of the. Yeah.
Cool. Ricardo, have we got any more questions in the chat box?
We have a couple of comments. And it says, in that sense, if you think that constructivism, as in developing own skills using a more knowledgeable other, is more important. That, I guess, goes towards the question you've just made, Bobby. Other than that, there's not a lot of questions. No.
Okay.
Guys have been more posting comments
Sure.
than questions in that sense.
Just on that, I don't think constructivism is more important than anything else. In the same way, I don't think behaviorism or cognitivism is more important than anything else. The approach that you lean into is in response to a moment of need. So what do the athletes need from you right now? And to some extent, based on, let's say, for example, you're 3 weeks into a camp, an EHF tournament somewhere, and the players are absolutely goosed. They are really tired. Cognitively, they're absolutely depleted. Physically, they're absolutely ruined. What they don't want at that point is to engage in a session that's underpinned by constructivist learning theory, because it's going to have no impact. At that point, they may want you to teach and instruct, and that is the skill of the coach, to recognize, understand, and be sensitized to what the needs of the athlete are there and then, and meeting them where they are. Does that make sense? So I wouldn't advocate one approach over the other. To quote Dave Collins, it really depends.
Yeah.
It's a great nod to Dave there, Derek. Thanks, mate. We've got a couple of questions, or colleague of mine, John Pierce, has thrown a question into the group, which we might save just for a little bit. I'm going to open up the poll again. Often in these chats, we've been asked for, have we got any examples, any inverted commas drills, any practices that we can use? So I'm going to open up the poll, and you guys can vote on the most common issues around decision making in attack and in defence. And then when we've got those results in, Ricardo and I might work together to produce something and send it out in the debrief email that goes out on this. So I'm going to open up the poll now, guys. While we're talking about the next thing, feel free to go ahead with that poll. So the poll is now open. This is probably more of a sum up kind of question for you, Derek and Fletch. So JP asks, what are the key things you wouldn't do? So top 3 things you wouldn't do, top 3 things that you would try, and maybe sharing your best coaching mistake. I know, Fletch, you've shared this with us, with England Handball before, but maybe we can reduce it to top 2 on those things. So 2 things you wouldn't try and 2 things you would do. Does that make sense?
Yeah, kind of. I mean, I'm happy to. So, what the 3 things you wouldn't do? I mean, I just would never assume, and I wouldn't have a plan, as in a rigid plan. I would have a direction of travel, and I know it might just be language, but I wouldn't have lots of stuff that I'm assuming is going to happen. So they're kind of linked. I think some of the stuff where I've come unstuck and I've really struggled, and it possibly hasn't been that effective, is where I've assumed lots of things, that this is going to lead into that. This person's going to behave like this. This is what's going to happen. So what I wouldn't do would be assume. I'm planning in terms of thinking and possibly writing some stuff down and noticing stuff. I wouldn't have any real massive detail to what I think's going to happen. Would be stuff around didn't. What's the stuff to try? I know Rusty was on a few weeks ago around the digital video game stuff. I would just go and throw yourself into it a bit. See what bits of it can be really helpful. So that's the stuff that I would try. Was there any other question, mate? Sorry, I'm trying to read it. I can't see
your top coaching mistake.
Oh yeah, the best coaching mistake would be around some individuals who I've just got wrong. So I've assumed, I've made an assumption based upon some information. I've probably then really worked hard to feed my own biases. And yeah, I've just got it wrong. So again, it would come back to, and it's quite a broad subject around really getting to understand the person in front of you. And probably not the one that presents itself to you. So actually, work hard. Don't just take it when I see this person or this team and they're presenting themselves in front of me, because they're likely to behave in a way that's going to be helpful for them getting selected or how they feel you want them to behave. So really find out some information that sort of fits around the person would be the stuff that I've got that wrong a few times.
Cool. Just on some of the stuff you mentioned there, Fletch, because I don't know if it conflicts or not, but some of the work that myself and Ricardo did with Bob Muir and Andy Abrahams at Leeds Beckett, and some stuff that we've listened to Ed Hall speak about the other day, was around this imagined future and expectations. So you've said about not having assumptions, but is there a difference between assumptions and expectations of your session?
Yeah, there is, and again, I've learned so much from Ed and hanging out. I'm fortunate that he lives in the area, and if people haven't listened to Ed's talk, he's been on a number of things. I think it would be worth it. It would be worthwhile. He's got some interesting views.
Fletch, I've got the video. Would you mind if I shared that with our?
Absolutely, mate. And anything that's on Magic is yours, mate. You can share anything. If you think any of the podcasts, any stuff would be useful, then
thanks.
We'll sort of share them.
Cool.
Go on, Derek. I'm curious to hear yours, mate. What's the stuff that you wouldn't do, and what's your best?
Yeah, a pretty heavy question to finish with, JP. So thanks very much for that. Top 3 things I wouldn't do. I would never assume that I'm finished in terms of learning as a coach. I think one thing we need to recognise as a coach is that we're perpetually unfinished. Our view, the way in which we view the world, and the way in which we view coaching is constantly in flux, so it will always change. And what I would say is that be conscious of that, be aware of that, and be willing to change with it. I will never assume that I know more than anybody else. There's always something that you can learn from people, irrespective of the level that they're at within the pathway or the stage of the pathway in which they work at. There's things that I can learn from really good kids coaches in the same way that I can learn from adult coaches. And I suppose the other thing that I wouldn't do is this might sound a bit contradictory, but I would try and avoid bringing my opinions to the coaching environment. I've got some pretty strong opinions on what coaching effectiveness is or where coaching could be, but I need to learn to leave those opinions at the door, because my job is to meet people where they are and not necessarily to present a view or defend a view of what I believe coaching to be. my biggest coaching mistake, assuming that I could change people. I think number one, and it probably ties into what Fletcher was saying around is just see the human in other people. But one of my biggest mistakes as a coach is that never showing in my athletes the human in me. I think too often we can put ourselves on a pedestal or distance ourselves from athletes, but they want to see the human in us as much as we want to see the human in them. So don't be afraid to share who you are with your athletes. I think that was probably one of the biggest mistakes I made earlier on.
Awesome, thanks, Derek. Just one more thing, and it's JP again who's asked. Maybe around the answers you guys have given have been awesome and very much around how you behave. And the stuff that he's asking now is more around the stuff that you would just avoid in session from probably a task design setup. So he's asking around the physical punishment for, I say punishment, but physical consequences. So, you know, a lap around a pitch, for example. I mean,
that serves no purpose other than to lose respect and relatedness with the athletes. I think punishing people for making a wrong decision is wrong because it stops people from making a decision full stop. And actually we should celebrate people being brave enough to make decisions in the context of training or the competition environment, irrespective of the outcome. The only wrong decision is the one that you don't make. I think the one thing I would advocate for is try and make training look as messy, as dynamic, and as active as possible, rather than settling in on structured drills and practices and lines. If you can design for the same learning intention through a messy game or messy practice, then I would advocate that over trying to drill something repetitively by laying out a very intricate sequence of cones and trying to get people to move through them.
Awesome, thanks, Derek. That's great. Fletch, anything to add, mate?
Yeah, mate. Just really quickly, I'd think about the start of your session. Try and sort of take off where you left the last one. Far too often, sessions sort of finish up here somewhere, often with the most helpful stuff, and then we start the next session down here, and sort of our learning opportunities go like that. I would make them. So yeah, I would try and finish. So he's trying to start the session kind of way. Well, actually, let's use the word harder. But so I'm going to use it harder than where you finished, and then just notice the stuff that's going to be helpful. Far too often, the sessions start with like 1-on-1 passing or 2-on-2 passing or a little game that's not that challenging type stuff. So try and make it really dynamic, quite difficult, lots of problems in at the start, and then just work through it with the team. And just think around the words facilitate and guide. I think they would probably influence then your behaviour. I know we talk a lot about behaviour as a coach. That would
awesome. There's two more questions. One I know the answer to. So Doc has asked, do you let players have an input on session design? I know 100% you guys would be well up for co-creating sessions with players and letting them have an input on rule adaptations and stuff like that. So we won't go more into that. But this again, it's from John. And John, the webinar was supposed to finish at 3, mate. So if you've got any more questions, I'm happy to send them out to the guys and get them to answer separately. But the question is around the level of players. So you've got a group of players that come into your session, and this is really kind of common in the UK. So you get your beginning handball player and your guy who's been in the performance pathway for 3 years playing at the same club. How would you guys, I don't know, go around supporting the development needs of both individuals? So stretching and supporting both of them at the same time. Is there any quick takeaway from you guys?
Yeah, I mean, you would probably hook them up pretty early. It might even be a secret mission with the person who has a bit more experience, or at this moment in time is being a bit more effective. So maybe sort of give him either a secret mission around looking to support the person who's new to it, or being a bit more deliberate about it, and then actually setting them some sort of challenges around. This is the stuff that you're gonna, that you're going to notice about them, type stuff. I mean, there'd be lots of other stuff that would support the differentiation. So, and it happens in all. It doesn't happen as much in terms of the performance side, but it definitely happens within a performance pathway and within the community game, that you have quite a lot in terms of the people who are different stages. So pairing them up would be some stuff that I would look to do, and then start to notice some stuff that's going to be helpful to them getting better.
Yeah. I think it's implied within the question that this isn't a performance setting, because it's not very often that you're going to have a novice handball player within that performance setting. So you really need to think about what your motivations are as a coach. Are you there to win, or are you there to develop people and players? And there is, I suppose, adding to what Fletcher's saying, there's an opportunity for the more experienced player to be developed as a leader and a person, and the novice to be developed as a player. And I think recognising that, and leaning on that and leading into social learning theory, I think is crucial, so that everybody's getting a decent outcome within that. Because aesthetically, it doesn't matter if practice looks perfect. Your job is to work with people to develop as people and as players at a pace that's right for them. And you need to recognise that sometimes the training is not always going to look perfect when you take that approach.
Awesome, great stuff, guys. I'd ordinarily just ask you guys for your top tips anyway, but you guys have covered that. So I suppose it's just for me to say a big thank you for taking the time out this afternoon to join us. It's been awesome. There's been a lot of mention around some of the underlying theories from psychology, social learning theory, self-determination theory and stuff. It might be interesting, and maybe we'll send out some links for people to go away and explore that a bit more if they're not familiar. Fletch, Derek, massive thank you. Closing remarks?
Just keep doing what you're doing, Bobby. I'm really liking watching from afar and seeing how England handball are trying to move coaching practice on. So I suppose, full disclosure on my end, I used to work for the Scottish Handball Association, so I have some experience in handball, and I'm really liking what I'm seeing in terms of what you're doing to try to develop your coaches. So keep doing what you're doing, and thanks very much for the substitute in, Bobby. It was really nice of you.
Cheers, Derek. Appreciate it, mate.
Mate, yeah, look, I mean, from my point of view, I've made as many notes as anybody else. I think from a coaching point of view, just stay curious. Probably be a bit more vulnerable to getting people in to sort of share some feedback and some thoughts and some stuff that you're doing well and all that sort of stuff. I'm still not seeing enough of it. I'm still seeing quite a lot of coaches who are probably far too mindful around that type of stuff. So stay curious, keep learning.
Awesome. Fletch, thank you so much. Derek, thank you so much. Guys, thank you for joining us. I hope you are all safe and well wherever you are. We are on Friday with Ricardo Vasconcelos presenting his ideas around 4-2 defense. Don't miss it. We'll send out the links for that if you haven't already got it. Guys, thank you so much and all the best. Bye-bye.
Cheers, mate.
Guys,
Bye-bye.